I would love is an extension cord.
Oh, right, you mean for your thing?
Yeah.
What's
you see
over here? Oh, no, those are,
Those are,
no, that's that. But
machinery
I don't
almost.
even see a normal plug. Oh, wait a minute, there's a normal plug on that side of you. Let me see if somebody has one in the back wall.
Yes. What, do you need 3 things or 2?
One.
I know what you mean.
No, 3,
3 prongs.
3 prongs or 2 prongs?
There's a
Yeah,
bigger
That's
one
right.
on your left, so that's good.
okay. So Drew, where are you?
In Virginia,
No kidding.
that foreign country called Virginia.
Well, I've heard about Virginia.
Did you see what I said about Virginia last night in my note to you?
No. What did you?
I have
Oh,
a
yes,
Russell
yes,
quote I
right.
sent you that I think speaks of what happened on Tuesday.
Right. I did see that, yep. Okay. But for some reason, I didn't associate it with Virginia, so
Well, that's because you're not here.
that's right. Okay. So, and who is that down at the bottom there? Is that?
That's Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, how are you, Mark?
Doing well.
Nice to meet you, Drew. This is Matt.
Yes, hi, man.
Thank you. Okay. Some possibility of not having this go away, okay.
Would you guys like the handouts?
Okay, we're just, are we about set?
There's 3 different, there's 3 different things that, sorry about that. You know what? I printed the code changes, but I did not send them out electronically because that just came from this morning.
You want me to send it?
It's in SureScan, so this is two-sided. If you could scan it and ask
Changes that were made.
Janelle to post it to the agenda. So for the benefit of Matt and Drew, one of the things Carolyn asked for this morning, oh, you know what, though? It doesn't do what I thought it did. I thought that it was going to have the strike-throughs, but it doesn't. It just takes it out and,
And replaces it.
darn it, it doesn't.
So it's not,
So it's useless, sorry.
I just thought it'd be useful to see what it
Okay.
was versus what we have now.
Sorry about that. I can dig that
well, we're
out.
just about time to start. Do we need to wait for her to come back?
I don't think so, but let me tell her that she doesn't need to do it because it's not what I was hoping it was.
It's hard to be organized at 9 o'clock in the morning. I've tried it before, and it was a failed effort.
I tell my guests, just do, I do the best.
What did Carolyn ask for this morning?
She wanted to have something that indicated what the code looked like before the last changes.
And usually, the ordinance would have that, but this was a total take out and replace, so it doesn't have the strike-throughs. So what I will do is I will research that after this meeting and get it out.
Okay, great. Okay, it's about 3 minutes after 9, and I'd like to start. So I'm calling this meeting of the ad hoc committee on the Code of Conduct to order. First, introductions. The committee members are Anne Marie Townsend, Drew McKay, Carolyn Jones, and myself, and Matt Boyer is here as our legal counsel. Matt and Drew are coming to us electronically from God knows where, and As a result, we have a member of the city staff, an appointed and elected official, and the Board of Ethics itself, with me as the chair, and legal counsel. So that's the mix. We're a small committee, and we are here to look at a request that came from the Board of Ethics to review the code of conduct in the light of several questions that we had. I'd like to begin, if it's all right, with a couple of notes and then open up the course of the conversation. The first one is to say, if you look at Title 29 of the Delaware Code, in Section 5.8, like as in 5801, 5802, 5803, 5802 has a little section called Legislative Findings and Statement of Policy. And I won't read that, but in that is, I think, the core of our concern, which is that on the one hand, it is the understanding, I believe, of the legislature that we need to have public trust, and that requires standards. At the same time, it says here, the activities of officers and employees of the state should not be unduly circumscribed. So there's the rub. You want to have standards, but at the same time, you don't want those to become, quote, unduly circumscribing the actions and the ability of officers of the state to act. So in that kind of nebulous area, something like the Board of Ethics exists to help people determine what it is they should do. There is an argument in some circles that we could be replaced by somebody who was a legal expert. That is to say, instead of having a Board of Ethics, you would have someone who is a legal officer who would pursue matters of what to do when, right? However, there's a reference in some of the code to what it is that reasonable people would do. And I think the issue is the Board of Ethics exists as a group of reasonable people. We are not experts in the law. We are not necessarily experts in anything. We are reasonable members of the community who come together and act as a Board of Ethics. That means, it seems to me, that a code of ethics needs, in a sense, to have a code of ethics, a code of conduct that we have needs to be specific enough to where most of the time we kind of know what it is precisely that you ought to do or ought not to do, and at the same time allow for enough freedom of action to where we can actually have opinions, do things, get things done, right? So we're here, it seems to me, to help shape the way in which we respond to a code of conduct. I am of the opinion that we ought not to have a body like this replaced by experts, because living in the world with some kind of code of conduct is a matter for all of us, not for dictate by experts. At least that's my thought. I have two notes on process before we begin. One is, this is an organizational meeting, and while we're glad to have in-person and Zoom attendees, only members of the committee will take part in the proceedings. Others will only speak if called on by the chair to do so. And at the end, I will invite comments from those attending, but the comments need to be limited to the matters under discussion in the session, which of course makes this, in some ways, possibly astoundingly boring. I mean, that is to say, you can't bring up everything you wanted to ever talk about in terms of ethical considerations by the city. We have to stick to the issues that we've got at hand. The minutes will consist of the recording of this meeting. The meeting is recorded?
Yes.
Okay. And written record of the decisions made by the committee. And I would ask if I and you, as the city administrator, would take notes on actual decisions we make,
Okay.
so that we can then submit them for approval at the next meeting when we start. Does that,
And Kayla will actually do the formal minutes.
well, you're actually going to do formal minutes?
I am.
Yeah, you don't normally get that because we administrative folks aren't in your session, so usually you
That
get
is
to do that
wonderful.
work.
That is wonderful.
Yeah.
Does all this meet the approval of the committee so far?
Yes.
Okay. Now, on matters of confidentiality, I would remind everyone that complaints and concerns brought to the Board of Ethics concerning possible violations of the Code of Conduct are confidential until such point as there's a need for a public hearing in the process of considering complaints. In the time that I've been the chair, actually in all the time that I've been on this committee, the board has never gotten to the point of actually having to have a public hearing that was open. So all of those conversations are confidential. That means that we need to be extremely careful not to become concerned with specific cases and begin to talk about decisions that we made in confidential sessions. At the close of each of these confidential sessions, there was a statement as to our determination of the cases, but the persons in the cases were never publicly, at that point, named, nor the specifics of the complaint, but rather that we heard a complaint, we discussed it, we made the conclusion that there was no reason to move forward, or there was a reason to move forward, but whatever decision we made, that was all done without reference to individuals. I am going to insist in these meetings that we steer clear, absolutely steer clear, of discussing things which would involve confidential matters. So when we talk about our experience in the Board of Ethics, we need to speak generically, not about specific cases. I think that's the way we need to go. Does that meet everybody's approval? And Matt, does that conform with your understanding?
Yes, definitely. I think to protect the confidentiality of those prior proceedings, we need to, respect that and certainly not be mentioning names or even any specifics that would be, so detailed that we'd actually be revealing the matter. So, I know we need to speak about experiences because they inform, what we want to consider, but hopefully we can do that in a general way that doesn't give away, so to speak, the specific matter we're talking about.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, with that in hand, I'd like to move to the agenda for the meeting. The agenda is determined by I don't have the actual agenda in front of me.
Here.
Give me sorry, I've got everything but the, here we go. There are 3 items on the agenda: to review the scope of the committee, and then have a discussion of the code, and then a discussion of a process for developing proposed amendments. The origins of the scope of this committee was a recommendation made by the Board of Ethics to the Marion City Council. And I'll read that. The Board of Ethics requests of Marion City Council a special committee of limited duration to review and possibly offer revisions to the Code of Conduct. This committee will look carefully at the whole of the code with particular attention given to the matters of 1, determining bias, 2, the extent to which the concept of the appearance of bias or personal interest unduly limits the free expression of ideas and opens public servants to harassment. And 3, the assertion in this current code of conduct that violation of the code is on the face of it a commitment of a misdemeanor. So those were the 3 items in particular that were pointed to. I believe we're empowered to review the whole code, but the impetus are these 3 specific problems. And there's a 4th one that I would like to add to that, which arose, and I'm sorry to say, did not make it into our little request from City Council, but it's a very specific piece having to do with who can sit on the Board of Ethics. It had come up through a criticism raised by a citizen that perhaps it was inappropriate for a member of the board to be both on the Board of Ethics and on a major commission of the city. That person was me, and although the conversation from that citizen never came to the point of a complaint, I thought it was a valid question. So I took it to the mayor and said, I think this person's right, so I either need to go off the Board of Ethics or I need to go off the Planning Commission, one of the 2. And he said, well, go off the Planning Commission and stay on the Board of Ethics. So I would like to see us think about making that formally a part of the Code of Conduct. So the questions at hand are the definition of bias, and the matter of appearance is the second one. And that has become a major concern because there have now been state decisions that because public officers act sometimes as in a quasi-judicial capacity, the question of their needing to recuse or to stand down from engagement in an action of their committee or council is not only because of actual or potential bias or prejudice or personal interest, but the appearance of it. And the appearance turns out to be an issue that is of major importance because I gather by this reading, in a quasi-judicial action, we are required, like judges, to not only not do certain things, but not appear to have done certain things. So that raises a whole set of questions that we need to look at. To what extent we are involved in quasi-judicial activity, and to what extent do people, for example, on council sometimes act in quasi-judicial ways and at other times not. So could you be informed as a member of council in ordinary session about matters which then, when you had to be in a quasi-judicial setting, it becomes clear that you actually had opinions or understandings that could be considered as biased or a cause for your standing down. So we need to really look at that.
Mr. Chair, can I add a wrinkle to that? And I'm going to look to Matt Boyer to see, I guess, get his thoughts. It strikes me that there are really, especially when it comes to mayor and city council, there are 3 roles. You mentioned the quasi-judicial. With mayor and council, there's also the legislative role. And in between there is also as I understand it, the ministerial role, which would be the site plan and subdivision type stuff where the rules are kind of set forward. Am I correct on that, Matt? That,
Well, yeah, generally, I mean, I think that there are those additional roles, and what Mark was speaking about in terms of the quasi-judicial role and the appearance of impropriety standard, I think that's only been applied when, say, a board is acting in a quasi-judicial role. So I honestly would have to look into how different the bias standard is when, say, a board is wearing the different hat and acting in a legislative capacity or a ministerial capacity. Sometimes that's called maybe an administrative capacity. But I don't know, again, given the scope of our charge, whether you all would want to look into the bias standard as it applies when the board is acting in those other roles. I would maybe pose that to Mark as to whether that's within the scope of our charge, or whether are we limited to, specifically to the Board of Ethics, which only acts, as I understand it, in a quasi-judicial capacity.
I guess the thought, though, is that these other boards and commissions where there have been complaints filed, perhaps, or the threat of complaints, sometimes
Right. So I
it's
see what you mean. So even though the Board of Ethics is only acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, it receives complaints about, say, public servants who are serving on these other committees, and then the question becomes, what standard are those people governed by, acting, say, in a legislative role?
Right, because
so I think as
legislatively,
part
you
of,
have good latitude. I mean, legislatively, bias is not necessarily a problem, but the way our code sets it out, it could be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the puzzle. The issue is bias and other reasons for recusal, or for charges of impropriety. There's a different standard if the person who's being accused was acting in a quasi-judicial way, or whether they were acting in a legislative role or whatever.
Exactly.
So, but the problem about bias is that we need to be really clear about what the limits of the kinds of things you can accuse someone of in terms of bias. At any rate, the mayor's nest is there. I mean, we're not going to go, let's not get into the weeds yet, but that's what the mayor's nest is about. The misdemeanor clause is very straightforward, or at least, apparently straightforward. At the end of our code of conduct, there is a statement that violations of the code make what the person's done a misdemeanor. Now, the question about, okay, so how is that pursued? I mean, what happens next is kind of an issue that has not been addressed and needs to be addressed because, frankly, there have been occasions when the Board of Ethics was reticent to move very far along the lines of issuing a violation because we were not ready to say that this rose to the level of being a misdemeanor. So we need to at least look at the question, why does it include this automatic assumption that a misdemeanor has been committed? We'll get there, okay.
Especially when you look at the consequences.
Yes. Then, as I suggested, the last question was the business about who can be on the Board of Ethics. In addition, the question about what sorts of items can be raised in making a claim that someone should recuse or that someone is biased. If I said something 5 years ago on some matter, and now am in public service, can that be raised as something which determines whether or not I need to recuse or I am biased in the current moment? This shows up in a number of different kinds of ways, and we need to have some conversation about whether or not conversations, utterances, etc., outside the specifics of the issue at hand, the matter at hand, right, can be brought in as a reason to say someone is either biased or should recuse on the grounds of conflict of interest or something. So that's a concern that we've got.
Or put a limit on the time.
Or a limit on the, but something, I mean, we need to have some discussion about what that piece is about. And the last piece is, all of this gets complicated because of an observation made by lawyers for the city, namely Glenn Mandelis and Max Walton, that the City of Lewes Code of Conduct is among the most stringent in the country. And the question is that our intent? Do we intend to have a seriously constraining code of conduct? We need to find out what those comments meant. Right?
Especially in a very small, engaged town.
Yeah.
It's very hard to not have relationships.
That's a great point, and I would just offer, but I'm sorry to inject myself, but Max Walton is my law partner, and we talk all the time, and we had a conversation about a training session that he did on the code of conduct for Lewes, and he made that same comment about, boy, this is a very strict, in some ways problematic code. So I would be happy to go back to him, Mark, if you would think it's a good idea, and just ask him specifically what were the things that concerned him that might have elicited that comment about the strictness of the code. So, and I could speak to Glenn as well, or you could, but just, I'd be happy to do some digging to really make sure we're covering or bringing to light what those concerns are so that your committee can address them.
Thanks. That would be very helpful, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of does anybody have anything else to say about this sort of, the range of the things that we're looking at? Have I covered most of the ones that we were?
I think you hit them all.
Okay. Item 2 on our agenda. Drew, you're being very quiet. Any thoughts?
I have lots of thoughts. I'm just waiting for when you want to hear some response to the issues.
Well, the next item on the agenda was to discuss a discussion of the city code and the state of Delaware Title 29, Chapter 58. And this, I'd like to suggest that we have a sort of general discussion of our perceptions of the two sets of codes and how, and where we see the discomfort, if any, with the current way that the code is written. I'd like to have that discussion for maybe not too terribly long, but maybe a half hour or as long as we need, to get kind of a feel from those of you who have read the code and understand what's going on here. And then we could come back to looking at a way forward. Does that make sense, just to sort of do a general conversation about the code? At which point, Drew, we'd be ready for all sorts of things from you.
Oh, yeah. First, I'd like to demur on behalf of Matt and myself that attorneys can be reasonable people too, not just private citizens. But I think the framework that we're talking about is complicated because I don't think the code can be so specific that it applies to all situations. And I think my suggestion would be that we need to elevate the responsibility of the Ethics Committee, so you should have stayed on the Planning Commission, Mark, to handle some things that really fall between the lines of any code. I am familiar with the structure of an ethics committee for legislative bodies, having been involved in many of those discussions decades ago and more recently in the U.S. Congress. I'm familiar with the state Public Integrity Commission and the Title 29, 5909 in particular, 5809 in particular. But I would just raise some questions that I think are illustrative of the conundrum that the code presents. First of all, if I were running for office, which I won't, and I took a position on a particular matter that's going to come before the city council after I'm elected, it seems to me that one interpretation of the code now would require me to recuse myself from any deliberation by the city council because of the strict interpretation of bias and or prior effect on the subject before you, which seems to me to a priori defeat the will of the voters. If I'm elected because I take a particular position, and then the matter comes before city council, and I recuse myself, I've in essence defeated the will of the electorate because I'm no longer eligible to exercise the will that was behind my getting elected. In Congress, they talk about how a matter may affect an individual versus a class, and I think we need to keep that in mind. For example, if I'm a veteran, I'm in Congress, I can still vote on the Veterans Department budget, I can vote on other matters affecting veterans because it affects a class, not an individual. And I think that distinction should be maintained. I think the additional information that we need to get from the Ethics Commission are to magnify the rules and procedures, specifically the guidelines, interpretations, and advisory opinions that govern the Ethics Committee, because that's really, I think, where the rubber meets the road, and I don't think a code can handle all individual matters. I think 5809 and Title 29 of the state code under the Public Integrity Commission, where it says a member cannot render an impartial or unbiased decision as the catch for when a change of that person's participation is required. I mean, we are talking about both elected officials and employees, not just the legislative body, the city council, because the code does cover both employees and elected members of the city council. I think it is important that we understand that elected officials have a certainly higher and different threshold to pass. They are accountable to the citizenry in ways that employees are not on a regular basis. But I think we need to set up, my perspective is a broader, more general perspective in the ethics code, sort of almost aspirational, but not really, and then rely upon advisory opinions and other things from the Ethics Committee to frame the application of those standards generally, and then specifically to deal with complaints. Of course, those complaints have to be confidential, and I don't like the idea of having public hearings on complaints by the Ethics Committee. I think that has to be done in confidence with counsel and meaning SEL, not CIL, guiding the work of the Ethics Committee in order to make it a fair. And finally, the burden in one of those proceedings should be on the complainant to establish due cause for the consideration, and then the respondent, of course, would have ample opportunity to respond. But I think we run down a slippery slope if we're doing all that in public. And I think that takes us beyond the scope of an ethics committee and puts us indeed wearing black robes in a judicial capacity that I don't think is intended or, frankly, would be effective for the city.
Well,
That was so eloquently done. Thank you. You touched on so many of these. Can you hear me?
Barely.
Okay, wait a minute.
You're good. You're lighting up.
Is it, okay. I said it was so eloquently done, you touched on so many of the areas that I had my concerns about, and it was so well put that I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was particularly struck by the issue about aspirational statement. Unlike the state code, which begins with a legislative findings and statement of policy, which is essentially aspirational, our code launches right into the nitty-gritty without much in the way of a preamble that states what it is we think this is about in terms of general legislative or philosophic understanding of what is needed from a code of conduct. So I think it would be one of the things I would ask Mr. Boyer is a local code, I understand, needs to be as stringent as the state code. And we have to pass it by the Public Integrity Commission in order to have changes in our code. But does that also, if it needs to be as stringent in terms of the code itself, do we also need to be as inclusive as the state code in terms of aspirational issues? For example, what I'm thinking about is, does the aspirational statement at the beginning of the state code operate, because we don't have one, as essentially the aspiration for our own code? You see what I'm trying to push at? I mean, or just because we don't have it in our code, does the state
It doesn't apply to us.
piece apply to us?
Well, I think you're free to have your own aspirational code. My understanding of the role of the Public Integrity Commission, and that's sort of the default standard in terms of actual rules, so that we can't go below that standard. As you were saying, it has to be at least as stringent. But that's talking about the standards themselves. I think when you talk about an expression of aspirational goals, I think you do have freedom to say, you know, as the city of Lewes, here's what our aspirational goals are, so long as they're not, you know, blatantly contradictory to the state's legislative statement. Again, it would, in any event, our changes, as I understand it, would go up to the PIC to be reviewed.
Right.
So if they felt like something we stated either in a standard or an aspirational statement was so radically out of line and less stringent than the state code, then maybe we would run into a problem.
We lost you, Matt.
We've lost you.
Matt, we lost your voice.
We lost.
Well, he'll come back.
I love technology.
Matt, you're just not here. Okay.
Can you guys hear me now?
Okay,
Yes.
now you're back. Okay.
Darn. And the problem is I don't know where I cut off in the middle of my soliloquy there. But long story, just make a very brief answer to your question. I think the city of Lewes has a lot more leeway in terms of expressing aspirational goals, so long as we don't fall below that minimal standard of the actual rules and standards that the Public Integrity Commission sets out in its rules.
Okay, thank you. Other thoughts on what Drew or Matt have had to say so far?
I really like the whole issue of leading with aspirational goals. I think, well, one, in the American Planning Association Code of Ethics, they totally restructured it several years ago to separate the aspirational principles from the rules of conduct. And the idea is that the rules of conduct support your aspirational principles. So you know, and I think it did two things. One, it kept people from filing frivolous ethics complaints based on aspirational principles, but not clear violations of rules. But I think the other thing I think it does is it gives the board the ability to relate the rules to the aspirational principles, and where there are potential gray areas, that's able to then inform how you deal with these things. I think, you know, it's very, I mean, how many times have we heard? It's very hard to legislate morality, and ethics, you know, comes down to morality. So with having the aspirational principles in the code that really support the rules, I think it gives a better and clearer setting of expectations for those of us who are bound by it, but also a better framework if there is an advisory opinion, a complaint, or whatever.
So, just to, a little piece of clarity here in our code, in 9.3, Standards of Ethical Conduct. The first piece is to pursue the interests of the city of Lewes in official actions. And we have understood that on the Board of Ethics in several cases to be the city of Lewis's interest involves everything from a general appreciation of the guiding dear Lord, I'm losing the word. Help me. The city has a set of
Priorities.
What was?
Goals, policies.
No. I'm thinking.
Core values.
Core values. Thank you.
Sorry.
The city has a set of core values. So, in part, pursuing the interests of the city is living into what those core values are about. The interest of the city also is not to make life so complicated that nobody can do anything. The interests of the city are fairly large. I mean, and they're quite broad and they're quite expansive. But it'd be helpful to have a little bit of setting out what we think in an aspirational way the interests of the city are, so that when you say an official or employee of the city shall pursue the interests of the city of Lewes in official actions, so you have some idea as to what that's about. That seems to me to be aspirational, not going to list all the things that are required.
Yeah, but there needs some clarity.
And frankly, it's different depending on which hat you wear.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're an elected council person, you're setting the policy. So if you're a staff person, in my view, that means that we pursue the interests of the city of Lewes, meaning we don't go outside of, if they say we care about this and not that, you don't publicly advocate for what they say is not the priority. I mean, but I think, again, depending on what hat you're wearing, how that specific applies to you can change.
Right. Okay, I have one other question I'd like to raise, which is the Delaware Code. I did a little word search. The word bias does not appear at all, except in one specific case where it says that, let me see whether I can find it exactly. I'm not going to find it exactly.
But that's telling.
The word bias doesn't appear, but
Interesting.
oh, here we go. Way down towards the end in 58(9)(c), a member of the commission may disqualify himself or herself from participation in any investigation of the conduct of any person upon submission in written and under oath an affidavit of disqualification stating that the member cannot render an impartial and unbiased decision. But that's the only reference to the word bias in the whole of the state code of conduct. So, and that's really in the context of what the actions of their Public Integrity Commission does. And so the question is, we have a whole section having to do with bias, and the state has none at all. Now, there are all, as I understand it, and the legal folks will have to correct me if I've got it wrong, that actually most of the issues that have to do with bias can be handled by reference to laws that have to do with things like discrimination or that sort of thing. So that there are laws out there that cover all of this stuff. It's just that the Code of Ethics doesn't use bias as a reference point for its own decisions. Now, that's an observation. There's nothing, I think the intention of having a statement about bias has got some real value to it. Because in fact, if I were to make a statement that under no circumstances would I accept any decision made by a woman because women are fools, then in fact, it would be perfectly legitimate to say, that's actually biased and you're out, right? Okay.
Well, but the other thing, and this is one of the things that I find
Really challenging, and this could be one of the things that Max mentioned. And again, as Drew mentioned, the standards of ethical conduct apply equally to staff, elected officials, appointed officials, and we have in section 9-3D that an official or employee of the city of Lewes shall not exhibit bias as to any matter. So let me just give a silly example. I'm a dog lover. Does that mean that I can't participate if we're writing beach rules about how we deal with pets on the beach? I mean, it's a bias, right? That's a straitjacket. None of us can do anything if we have no bias on any matter, right?
And we're not without bias on something.
Well, help us out there.
But that's where we go, that's where the standard of whether it is something that affects an individual or individuals versus the class.
Right.
You know, because you love dogs and you want to deal with matter on the beach, that doesn't just affect your dog or dogs, it affects all dogs and dog owners. That's a class matter, not an individual matter. I think that's the distinction.
Okay, but how would you apply that to the following? I'm on a committee, and we're discussing a kind of a thorny problem, and so we call in an expert, and the expert comes in and tells us that we can expect higher than usual winds in the future, and then proceeds to tell us why we should expect higher than usual winds. So now I have a piece of information that came to us in a public meeting, and I've been influenced by that. I now believe that, in fact, we're likely to have higher winds than we've had in the past. But I was informed about this by an expert, and I took the expert's advice, and I'm kind of absorbed that. So now comes along a decision about whether or not we can build a structure that withstands a certain wind, but only up to a certain point. And I say, we can't have that structure because it won't withstand these stronger winds that are predicted. Well, am I biased by virtue of what I've learned?
Yeah.
Or am I simply making use of what I've learned?
I think under 9.3C, that's exactly the latter, which is exercise impartial independent judgment based on analysis and consideration of the record of a matter, applicable law and precedent, in the best interest of the city.
Right.
You get an independent judgment, particularly in a public forum.
Right.
I don't think there's any quote-unquote bias as a result of that kind of discovery or information.
So, well, I'm under the impression that that occasionally gets challenged. That is to say that people have raised challenges about, you've been so influenced by the information that you received that you're not willing to consider other options. And therefore, you essentially have been, you have bought the Kool-Aid, whatever the Kool-Aid is. You've brought into one side of an argument about making predictions about the future. And I agree with you entirely, but it's not very clear. I think we may need to expand slightly on that statement that you just read from, it's from C3D, is that right?
9.3C.
Yes.
C, in C, right.
Right.
The record of a matter, that's the kind of itchy piece in there. The record of the matter includes the information that we've gotten from experts and/or legal advice or other, right? The record includes the best advice we can get.
Mm-hmm.
So if I act on that, and somebody comes along and says, that's really awful advice, right? Therefore, you're acting out of a prejudice based on your liking this advice, as opposed to being open to other options.
And frankly, with the increasing polarization in society on, what science is and what science supports, I can see that playing out, right?
Yeah. Well, we're now beginning to sort of see some of the more weedy pieces of all of this. Are there other observations on the two documents, the state and the city code, and where do we see issues rubbing up that we need to look at?
I think we need to look at this, we just got this I just got this statement today, so haven't had a chance to make a comparison of the two. I think we need to.
Yeah, and let me
We don't have time
apologize,
to do that.
because the only way I could get that state PDF was to download all of 29, and it wouldn't let me edit it. I couldn't even pull out just the pages I wanted, so.
Yeah. I was able to pull it out, but
Right, so.
it took some work.
Yeah, so we did, when we printed it out, and it took us a while even to just get those sections to print, what I can do is I can scan that and put it,
Right.
replace what's up there with that.
Did Drew and the others get this?
Well, they got it attached to the agenda with all 600 whatever pages of Title 29, unfortunately.
Okay.
I have it. I downloaded it, so I have it all.
You can get Title 29, Section 58 as a separate item online because the Delaware Code Online does it for you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, because I couldn't,
Yeah,
okay, and
that's-
Sue Ann
that's-
tried, and she actually called the Public Integrity Commission, and they told her just print the pages you want.
So,
We've got a Q and A in the box.
right.
Kayla had to leave, so,
Can I, Mark, make one additional echoing of a point someone else made?
Okay?
I think it's important as we try and evaluate the Public Integrity Commission's code and rules, that we remember we're talking about a small community, a very deeply connected small community that has, I think, significant consequences when we're talking about issues of influence, information, accreditation, et cetera, which in my mind should be filtered by the Ethics Committee. Is going to be impossible in my mind to codify enough of the exceptions or nuances to some of these aspects, so that we really have to rely upon the Ethics Committee issuing advisory opinions without regard to complaints to cover some of these matters going forward. I mean, I think that's why we have, no pun intended, reasonable people evaluating, interpreting for the city of Lewes, not for the state of Delaware, not for the United States, but for the city of Lewes, the applicability of some of these goals and aspirations and standards that we all want. So I think, again, we have to remember that we need a filter, and that filter has got to be the Ethics Committee.
Can you see the question that Bob Heffernan has in the Q&A? It says,
I can't.
what would the answer be to Mark's question? And I can't see the screen, and I can't, if I'm not at the mic, you can't hear me. So, but basically saying when there's, when it's supported by science, can we, and he said, can we agree on the laws of gravity and physics? And I think that, and I think that's one of the things we need to discuss, not very specific, but to what degree different, that learning things is considered a bias.
Yes.
Well, okay, I think if we drew back from that just slightly, here's, my understanding is that if we are asked for an advisory opinion, we give that, and we've been very careful to say, this is our opinion. You still have got to make the decision about whether you're going to recuse, if that's an issue, or you still have got to make the decision as to whether or not you think you're biased. I mean, those are, our opinion doesn't determine what you do. You're still a free agent, right? But it does give you our best advice as to whether or not you are likely to get in trouble if you don't recuse, or if you continue in stating whatever your bias happens to be. So we give that advice. Now, the State Commission, as I understand it, says that if we make an advisory, if the State Commission made an advisory opinion, the person who received that opinion is now no longer, if they receive an opinion that there's no problem here, or you're okay, then they're okay. I mean, they can't then be, after that point, accosted for not having recused. If the state board had said, our advice is you don't need to recuse, then they don't recuse, they are no longer at fault, in a sense. They are freed from any, because they've gotten this advice from the board of, the state board.
If the
Yeah, but
board
that-
says you need to recuse and you don't,
Then that's your problem.
right, okay, but if they
the
say
board
you
says
don't need to,
recuse,
right,
then
you've
that
got
person
cover.
is, they can do what they need to,
Right.
whatever they want to do.
Right.
The reason for raising this is that I think, at least on the state level, the issuing of an advisory commission, advisory opinion can count as a freeing agent for the person who's asked for the advice.
It's a level of protection.
It's a level of protection for
Yes.
that person.
Yes.
That is not necessarily clear in our city code. We can give that advice, but it doesn't say that the person who received the advice, if they take it, is now freed from
No, it
having to worry
doesn't in
further.
any way make you feel.
Yeah.
Right.
So we need to take a look at
Can you
that.
point to the language? I just want to understand exactly, because I think some of it has,
To do with the issue of if you get an advisory opinion and follow it, what is the obligation in that the city then
What are the
covers
consequences?
you if there's litigation.
Right.
And
Right.
is that what it comes down to? Because
That's what
it
you have to
certainly
be-
doesn't protect you in the court of public opinion, even if the...
Right.
But I think that the important thing is that if you're acting in accordance with your conscience and the Board of Ethics advisory opinion, you shouldn't personally, that you're not subject to that legal risk. Is that what it comes down to?
Well, you have to be careful with
Here's,
that, because that's the...
okay, here, under 5807C,
see, okay.
the
Discipline or
commission
sanction.
may issue an advisory opinion as to the applicability of this chapter in any particular fact situation. Any person who acts in good faith reliance upon any such advisory opinion shall not be subject to discipline or other sanctions
Okay.
here with respect to the matters covered by the advisory opinion, provided there's a full disclosure to the commission or commission council
Okay.
of material facts necessary for the advice.
So I can give examples of when I've known people who've gone through the Public Integrity Commission in that regard. I've known state employees who have either gone on a local planning commission or perhaps gotten on a local city or town council, and typically, if they're a state employee, they will go to the Public Integrity Commission to make sure that they're clear of conflict. And, for example, Mike Mahaffey did that before he went on to the City of Lewes Planning Commission. I worked with him at the time, so I know that. So they tell you kind of what your guardrails are.
Right.
That you can't, you can't go against your employer, and so there are certain situations where you may need to recuse. So I've seen, and the other place where I think that plays out is where you have somebody leave the state employment and then they go work for a consulting firm. And there are certain rules, so typically they will go to the State Public Integrity Commission to make sure that they're not in a position, that
And so having been given the advice from the Public Integrity Commission, they are then, in a sense,
well, let me,
Freed.
so freed,
Within those-
within whatever those
within those
guidelines.
constraints,
For
right.
instance, if I work for the state and I leave and I go work for the consultant that has all the state contracts that, and I don't go to the Public Integrity Commission and I don't have that, you could be potentially sanctioned
Right.
for violating the state's code of ethics. So that's why everybody who does those things, typically before they will engage, they will go to the Public Integrity Commission. And my understanding from people I know who have gone through the process, the guardrails are kind of set for them.
Okay. That gives us a little bit more sense, I think, of some of the kind of question I wanted to ask of our code is whether or not we need in any way to further specify what an advisory opinion means. That is to say, does it carry weight in terms of, if you follow the advisory committee, you're safe?
Right.
No, you don't.
You know, and I don't know, again, the people that I am most familiar with at the state level are employees.
Right.
So I'm not aware of elected or appointed officials that have gone through and what types of advisory opinions they've gotten. The ones that I'm directly aware of have all been people who have employment issues, and they want to make sure that their employment and their,
It's very different.
yeah, in my view, that's different than the type of thing we see here. I'm not aware, and Mark, you can tell, I mean, you don't have to tell me if I'm wrong. I'm not aware of any city employees who have come to the Board of Ethics looking for an advisory opinion.
It really is.
I mean,
Not
I
yet.
think you guys are looking at different kind of set than what I know of. I'm not
Yeah, we're
saying that
talking about
the
it as
state
an
doesn't
official
deal with
level.
that, but that's where I'm not.
Well, that's a good beginning conversation about the two sets of codes of conduct. Matt, do you have any further comments at this point you want to make?
Well, this is really interesting, and the only other thing that really I've been mulling in my mind since Drew mentioned it is whether the hearings, if we were to have one, would be public or not. I just mentioned I worked for several years for the Office of Disciplinary Counsel, which is the body that enforces ethics rules for attorneys, and our state has always held those hearings in private, whereas a lot of states, and again, just drawing the analogy to lawyers, would make those hearings public. So it's an interesting topic we might want to discuss. I think the interest in keeping it private is a person is assumed, innocent until proven guilty. So if you have all this dirty laundry being played out in public, is that fair to the accused? But then again, the sunshine interest in having public, government proceedings open to the public weighs in as well. So anyway, I just thought that was an interesting issue that Drew raised, and if I can help in discussing that, if it's of interest, I'd be happy to.
Well, as I understand it, our code says that the beginning of this process is confidential, and it's only if the Board of Ethics determines that there's sort of probable cause, that there's some reason why we ought to proceed with whatever the complaint is to the level of investigation. And at the level of investigation, then there's a transfer over to the meetings no longer being confidential, but in fact being meetings at which people come and can speak, and it becomes a public, on some level, a public, the content becomes public.
But Mark, at that point, you've done your preliminary investigation to determine that there's a there.
Yeah.
So
That's
it's
right.
not like I'm blindsided.
Right.
It's not like I've been doing everything, towing the line, and have no idea, and then suddenly it's.
That's right. So the initial conversation is confidential, confidential to the point where we don't, in calling the meeting to discuss this, we only say that there's a case for which we're having a meeting, and it's an executive session, and so forth and so forth. And then we pursue that as a confidential matter. But if in fact there's a there, and we need to proceed further, at least according to the code, at some point that transfers over from being an executive session matter to being a more public matter. But anyway, we can look at that as an issue that we can decide whether or not we want to make any of the changes that way. I would like to take a pause at this point, and this may be the point to ask whether or not there's any comment from people not members of the committee, because the next section is going to be fairly dry, namely figuring out where we go from here. But would it be all right if we entertained any kind of questions or concerns that might be present from the group?
We've got 3 people on the Zoom,
Yep,
so if you want to
If-
give them an opportunity to raise their hand.
right.
And then there's Rick and Joan as well, but.
Right. So the issue is, do any of our listeners, right, present or by Zoom, have something that they wish to say? And if so, raise your hand. Okay. We got one. Anything on?
Nothing, in fairness, 2 of them are your spouses, so.
Doomed. Okay. So we've got one person.
And we've got one on the Zoom.
Okay. So let's take the one on the Zoom first, and then we'll take you. Okay?
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and promote him to a panelist so you can see him.
Okay.
So it's Bob Heffernan, and he should be a panelist now, so Bob should be able to turn on his camera if he would like.
Oh, there he is.
Good morning.
Good morning, Bob.
I guess a thing I have talked with some people about is Drew's question of what a politician can and do say beforehand is very relevant to all members of Lewis's community, because you can talk to people about all kinds of things, and sometimes occasionally be misquoted, and then you end up in a, you go to a party, you talk to somebody, you say, I think that's a crazy idea, and under our current rules, that's bias. I guess the other thing I have to Mark's question is, if we were lucky enough to have a world-class expert on the jet stream on one of our panels, and we have had some experts, the current code almost, if that person has written or expressed opinions, almost excludes them using that. I mean, Mark's example was, if they come from, and I learn in a formal setting, but what if I already know? I mean, we've had nuclear engineers on some of our panels. We've had people from all walks of life. Lewes is a very rich and special place. And the fact that they might know more than the average person is, and use that information should be inclusive, not exclusive. And I apologize for the question earlier, because I kind of hit enter trying to get another line. But I mean, I think we should use all of our resources, and if somebody really is knowledgeable, they should be allowed to use that and not have to manipulate the system around so that they get an expert to testify to them.
Okay.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Bob.
Rick?
Should I come up here?
Sure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rick Quill. I reside at 407 East Market Street, Lewes, Delaware. I own a business called the Blue Water House Bed and Breakfast. I'm overwhelmed. 15 years, and I'm not going to sling arrows, Mark. I'm not going to come up grenades. If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it is a duck. When Bob Dylan says, I wish you could walk in my shoes for 1 mile, and for that moment I could be you, then you know what a drag it is to see you. And I'm not going to go into the litany again of everything that's transpired in this town because we cannot change the past. I don't know if this is going to bear any fruit because to me, it's another ambiguous effort to get to a goal that I believe is unattainable. I believe that when Lincoln says at the Gettysburg Address, and I'm paraphrasing, that what we do and what we say will soon be forgotten. But then at the end he laments, but we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And when there is transparency issues, equitable issues, fairness issues that are always tainted by politics and biased opinions, when this town has done numerous times baking cakes without all the ingredients, the main one being yeast, the people. This is going to change. And why? Because in the past, I can tell you for the last 15 years, when I hear chairs and mayor and council talk about public participation, but then when they only hear what they want to hear and they disregard the rest, and when people come up and want to talk what's on their mind, and then they get shut down. You only got 3 minutes. You only got 5 minutes. Why? Panels wax on and on and on and on. It's a disgrace. That is not democracy. We are the first town in the first state. We can do better.
Okay.
And we should do better. I believe there is a sea change in this town, and it was by voting. Voting. It pains me to think that this town does not involve their citizens.
Okay, let me cause, I want to poke for just a second back, right? Which is to say, hone your remarks to be dealing with the issue about the code of ethics, because that's what we're, that's
Well, the
what
code of ethics, okay, Mark, I'll be fair with you.
Yeah.
I don't believe that anything can be done about the code of ethics, because it's just such a gray area. That's why I'm up here saying it. I applaud everybody's time. I really do. I've never discounted anybody's time who's given up on panels and committees or events like this. I personally wish I never got involved with any of this 15 years ago. I wish I never. I just want to run my business. I just want to bring value to the city. I just want the members of this town to read the code and the comp plan and apply them equitably.
Okay.
So I'm just going
Thank you. Wait,
No,
let me
let me
just,
one more.
let me, okay. Well,
I just want to read one thing.
Okay.
So I had a little gem this morning on the Facebook page. You cannot compete with me. I want you to win too.
That's actually very,
Gotcha.
that's good. Okay,
I have a lot more to say, but I won't say.
okay, as a, let me say that what I sense of your frustration is shared by the Board of Ethics, who wants if at all possible, to help the community act in ways which are all of the things you were talking about: transparent, equitable, not operating out of bias, not operating out of undue personal gain, all those sorts of things. The quandaries that we're, and this is incidentally, you're quite right, it's unclear whether or not this will change anything in the universe, right? But the little piece that we've got to deal with is that we are, in fact, a board of ethics in a small town, and we're trying our best to understand what it is that counts as an adequate code of conduct that, on the one hand, allows us the breadth of action that we need in order to really have complex and involved conversations, but at the same time, lower the level of bias and the level of conflict of interest to the kind of expectations that we have for community life. So that's what our difficulty is. And the frustrations that you're stating are just there. I mean, they're very real. I understand that. What we're here working on is a very specific small piece of this, which is we have a code of conduct in which people can challenge one another about their conduct. And at some point, that shows up to us. And so then the question is, how do we deal with complaints about conduct? So that's what we're about. I would like to, unless there are people who want to respond further at the moment, I would like to move to the question about where we go next. And does that make sense? Are people ready to do that?
Sure.
Members? Drew, you ready to do that?
Yeah, can I ask a question
Yeah.
of you, Mr. Chair? Are we accepting public comments, writing or otherwise?
What's that? Are we
Is this
accepting
committee
public comments?
accepting public comments in writing or otherwise?
I just did. I think it's not a bad idea in each of our meetings to have some point where people who have had enough interest to actually show up can say something that is constructive to the group. Yeah.
Well, my point would be, Mr. Quill, I would invite him to submit specific written comments or points about the code that he wishes us to consider. If he has some 15 years experience dealing with some of these issues, perhaps he has some language or guidance he'd like to share, but I think we need to get that in writing, would be my suggestion.
May I answer that?
Sure.
Can you come up?
Yep.
Thank you, Drew. I could write a book and a litany. I don't think it's necessary. I'll be honest with you. I understand what you're looking for, but I think that going forward, you can't dwell in the past. Although it affects me dramatically, I just think the basic thing is what I learned from my mother and father. There's right and there's wrong and there's consequences. And on a daily basis, I know every time, and I've committed a lot of wrongs, that I own them. All I'm asking for is governance that is, and I'll repeat it, is fair, equitable, and transparent. And I've asked 1,000,000 times, and you know this in a lot of things.
Okay.
Why do we not? Why do we create adversarial positions by doing ordinances or whatever government work has to be done without the implicit input of the people who it's affecting? And every time I've gotten an answer, dozens of times it's on records, FOIA, 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 which translates means We posted at the City Hall outside these doors. We posted in the Cape Gazette, and we posted on the internet. And I've always said, that's not good enough.
Okay, so,
Let me finish. You should, in order to eliminate all the animosity, and there's animosity out in this community, I can tell you that. You could have avoided all this by bringing the parties together, and if they didn't want to come, forever hold your peace. But instead of waking up one day and saying, when did that pass? I had no idea. I want a better government. I want a better government here because we all deserve it. This is the best town in the state of Delaware. And we are driving that train forward. Thank you.
We're working on that, Rick.
I know you are.
know that.
I know that. Carol.
Okay.
I know that with you.
so in terms of Drew's request of you, Rick, you've actually hit one of the aspirational pieces that we were talking about earlier. The work that I believe that the work we're doing needs to be related to precisely the kind of aspirational pieces you're talking about. So it would be interesting to see whether you have any suggestions about how we frame the work that we're doing. So, for example, in addition to the issues about transparency, that be framed in the context of, in the pursuit of better government, we put together this code of conduct. That would be an interesting way to think about having a code of conduct. It exists not to enforce a set of rules, but to in fact provide better government. Anyway, play with it a little bit, Rick. In there, I believe, in the midst of a much broader set of stuff that you were just raising, there can in fact be useful pointers for some of the work we're doing. So work on it, if you would, please. I'd like to turn, if it's all right, to a small discussion about a proposal for developing proposed amendments to the Code of Conduct. What we have is the code that we've got in place. I will quote Rick Quill and say, you know, the past is the past. What we're dealing with is what we've got. The question is, do we see any proposed amendments, and if so, what would they look like? I believe some of them are so simple that I can write them out in the course of 10 minutes, like who can be on the Board of Ethics. That's a really simple one. I think I can write something out as an initial proposal. I believe the issue about what constitutes, or how we should look at the misdemeanor clause, that's a little more difficult, but I have a suspicion that Matthew Boyer might be able to help us out a little bit on that.
The other thing, and I don't want to take anything from that, because I've got plenty on my plate too, but we could look at what some of the other municipalities have as their violations and penalties.
Right. That would be really helpful. But those are, I don't believe, are the really tough ones. The tough ones turn out to be, we have bias as a category that we are expected to deal with in terms of the Board of Ethics. And the question is, what do we do with that?
And that's a big one.
It's a big one, and it was brought in by people with good intentions and the hope for better government. And the question is, to what extent is it useful, and how do we proceed to hone it a bit? And then the really thorny one for me is the issue about the appearance of bias or conflict, and the extent to which that constrains actions on the part of members of our community in an inappropriate way. That is to say, that if the appearance of, well, I'll use a completely different word. It is arguably inappropriate for me to have, to be involved in sexual innuendo with a member of the staff. So, I decide that it'd be really, really good that Ann Margaret and I have lunch together. And somebody comes along and says, there's the appearance of impropriety here, Mark. And I say, no, I'm having lunch with a member of the staff here because it'd be really interesting to have a good conversation and we'll have it over lunch and it'd be good, right? The appearance of impropriety would count as a basis for my being removed from office, if in fact this involved a conversation about a quasi-judicial activity. I mean, who knows? I'm pushing, obviously, an example which, pardon my having used it, but which may be a little far from me, stretching reality a little bit. But the problem is the appearance of impropriety is a very thorny issue. And when you can invoke that, it seems to me to be something that we ought to be very careful about. So the two issues that I think we need to really wrestle with are the issue about bias and the matter of appearance of bias, or the appearance of a conflict of interest, or whatever. I would like to see those two really pursued with some care in the next couple of weeks, and that when we come back together, that we begin to have shaped some kind of way of responding to those issues. What I would like to suggest as a process is that we have a second meeting. We can't have them closer than 8 days apart, but I'm going to
Well,
suggest...
you can have them as close as you want, as long as we post the agenda. at
Yeah,
least
but
7 days
that
apart.
takes a week, doesn't it?
Right, but if you say we want to have it on this,
Yeah.
we could post, but
So, but
there's also reality.
There's also reality. I would, is it appropriate to think that we as a small committee could do the work in 2 weeks on the two big issues, the one about bias and the other about the appearance of bias and or conflict of interest, and be able to come back with something like the beginning of a shape for any recommendations of change. Do you think that's possible for us to do that in 2 weeks?
We can start looking.
Come back with ideas.
I think we could come back with ideas, absolutely.
What do you think, Drew?
Mr. Chair, you've asked Matt to consult with other counsel who have opinions on the code as being somewhat problematic or harsh. I mean, I would defer to see if Matt thinks we can get something before the 19th from the other councils that would be useful. And our ideas, I would suggest, if we have any, should be circulated amongst the committee members and Matt as soon as they come up, so that they can be
Have something like that.
massaged a little bit before we get together on 19th. I wouldn't want to wait until the 19th to get everything dropped in the hot.
Well, I don't know what the word the 19th came up.
That's
What-
2 weeks.
2 weeks. I was
That's
just
2
using
weeks.
that
Okay,
as 2
thank you.
weeks.
There's a problem there, which is, I believe, as is true of any other committee of the city, if more than 2 of us talk, we've begun to have a meeting.
Right.
So if we share documents among ourselves, are we in effect having a meeting?
So
what do
you can send one way, but you can't reply to all. So if, for instance, Matt has something he wants everybody to look at, and you have something you want everybody to look at, you just can't respond. So, but at least they can look at it and then come with their ideas at that next meeting.
Okay, so is that right, Matt?
I will defer to Anne Marie. I think she's probably more the expert on that, but it certainly sounds right to me.
Okay, so the issue is, any of us can send stuff to all the rest of us, but don't respond. Right. Right.
Right.
I mean, you can respond and say, I got it.
Right.
Right.
But and the main thing is, don't respond to all, don't get into where there's a
Conversation going on by email, because that ends up being a meeting outside of FOIA.
Sure.
Right.
Just remember, as Mark would say, where 2 or 3 are gathered, we're having a meeting.
Yeah, that's the problem. And it also works out serially, too. I mean, that is to say, if I have a meeting with you, and then I have a meeting with you, and we're talking about the same stuff, then we've had a meeting.
right.
Okay, so Anne Marie's point is, we can share information and ideas, but we don't have a conversation about that sharing, we just share those. When we come back together in the public meeting, that's when we in fact share the content, right? Share observations back and forth. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is that we meet Matt, do you think you could do this in 2 weeks?
You know, somewhat depends on how soon I can get the information from Glenn and Max Walton. I'm a little concerned because I have a huge Delaware Supreme Court argument next Wednesday, so I'm totally out of pocket. But I can certainly reach out to them now and see how soon they can get me something that I can distribute. But why don't we shoot for it? I'll do the best I can to pull things together.
Okay, so then right now, let's target the 19th.
Okay.
But don't announce it into a week beforehand, and then by that time, he'll know whether or not he's...
So we could potentially plan to meet on the 19th, definitely discuss penalties, definitely discuss membership.
Sure, okay, perfect.
Get those issues off the table, and
Okay.
if we can discuss the thorny issues,
Great.
then we can. If not, then that comes for the next meeting. So what you had asked me early on, Mark, was to look at every other week. So honestly, if we want to do every other week, if Friday morning's okay, we could meet on the 19th, the 3rd, and the 17th as our plan for our next 3 meetings. I'm off the 17th, but I'm not leaving town until later in the day, so I could do a morning meeting. So if we want to do 9 o'clock on those,
I can't do the 17th.
oh, you can't do the 17th? Well, I mean, so I guess, do we want to at least plan the 19th and the 3rd?
Let's
and
do
then-
that, yeah.
Okay.
The other question that I've got about the procedure is whether or not, when we have in hand a set of recommendations, do we want to have a hearing, or do we pass the recommendations on to City Council and let them have the hearing?
You can do either. I think it's one way or another. I think it's beneficial to have a hearing, but I think my guess is so there's no code requirement that it have a hearing, but Carolyn, would you agree that it's probably, if you pass it to council, I would expect that council would want to have a hearing. So, and you could pass it to council with the recommendation that they hold a hearing.
Okay, so we don't have to hold a hearing,
No, you
but
don't.
we can, okay, so that loosens us up a little bit. So at the moment, we've got the 19th and the 3rd as dates, and we will for sure on the 19th discuss the other questions, but the matter of bias and the matter of appearance and the question about why we are considered to be more stringent than anybody else in the state, and maybe in the nation, we can get all of that on the board whenever it's possible. But at least on the 19th, we should come prepared to deal with those other issues. You'll pursue the question about what other towns do about penalties.
Yeah, we can do that, and Matt, since you're very busy, I can I mean, you're welcome to, I don't want to take it from you, you're welcome to come up with stuff, but I can definitely do some research on that too.
That would be great, thank you.
Okay, does that sound like a way forward for the moment? Does anybody have anything else they need to add to the meeting at the moment?
Can I just say one other thing?
Yes.
I just want this panel and everybody to know that although I can say I take this personally, I can compartmentalize my feelings because I don't live this every day. I don't live this every hour. I feel grateful and blessed not only being in this community, to just be where I'm at in my life. And I can honestly say is, I just, when I talk about these things, it's not to attack anybody or personalize or dismantle them. It's only in the my mindset is, and again I repeat, we can do better. We can all do better.
Thank you. That actually is the spirit in which it was received. So, we're on.
Want a motion to adjourn, Mr. Chair?
The motion has been to adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye?
Aye. Aye.
Are you
Done.
voting or ex officio?
You're voting.
Okay,
You're
I'm
an
not
actual-
used to, actually.
Yeah, you're an actual member of the committee. Thank you. Thanks, Rick.
And you can't get off that easy, Anne Marie. Or Anne Margaret.
I'll vote to adjourn. I can do that. Don't make me vote when it gets to controversial stuff.
That's very nice. We second it and it's over.
Let's get off the air.
All right.
Okay.
All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
Nice meeting you guys.
Good to meet you.
Same.
I just hung up on that.
That's okay. I got it.
Joan, thank you.
That you
You were very